So America's Constitution was modeled after God's covenant with ancient Israelites. But now do we see modern Israel modeling itself after America, the land of the free?
Here in Jerusalem hangs an exact replica of America's Liberty Bell, famous for its inscription from Leviticus 25, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Well, does Israel proclaim liberty to all its inhabitants? We're talking about that and more with Jerusalem Post commentator Gil Troy and CBN's own Middle East analyst John Waggy. So Gil, talk about it. What about Israel's relationship and liberty?
This Liberty Bell not only represents the friendship between the United States of America and Israel, but the aspirations that we share. And think about it, Israel has never known a day of peace in its life, but it's also never known a day without freedom, liberty, democracy, here in the Middle East. And so it really is quite extraordinary, and it goes back to the Bible, because the Bible articulates a series of values about equality, about virtue, about justice, about righteousness that is the core of any democracy.
Mm-hmm. John, I understand you were a little surprised that individual rights and freedom took such a foothold here in modern Israel, especially with the form of its first government.
Yeah, you know, Paul, what struck me in reading the history of modern Israel was that the Almighty, in His wisdom, used secular socialists to found the nation. And I read an interesting thing about Shimon Peres, who just until late in life was the president of Israel and was there at the very beginning with David Ben-Gurion. And the way he wooed his wife and tried to persuade her to marry him was that he quoted Karl Marx. He would sit by the moonlight and quote passages to Sonia of Karl Marx. And I thought, wow, what a start, you know?
And yet they had such respect for liberty and freedom here. They did. Well, Gil, probably the most outstanding feature of America's Declaration of Independence is the statement that all citizens are endowed with inalienable rights. God gives these, government must not take them, mustn't infringe upon them. Does Israel believe in this concept of inalienable rights?
Well, if you read the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which was very much modeled on the American Declaration of Independence, and David Ben-Gurion himself had two very helpful experiences. One, in 1915, he found refuge in America, and two, in 1923, he visited the Soviet Union. And he wanted to run away from the Soviet Union model and run toward the American model, so he was kind of a Jeffersonian socialist. And so inherent, not only in the DNA of the Jewish people through the Bible, and not only inherent in the Jewish people's DNA because they've been arguing and yelling and screaming at one another for so many years, is in Israeli democracy and in the Israeli Declaration of Independence is a promise of equality for all its inhabitants. And when they say the inhabitants, they're well aware of the fact that it's going to be a majority Jewish state, but there will be a Christian and Muslim minority. And so from the very start, there always this commitment to equality and liberty, and it's worked.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, speaking of that, Israel is the only Jewish nation in the world, and yet it's been very strong in protecting religious liberty, even for believers who would want to destroy the Jews and their religion. Why do you think it's been so firm on this, and what that meant?
Well, I think that it goes back to the Bible, for one thing, and for another thing, the Jewish people themselves, after they were scattered, after the Romans sacked Jerusalem, they were the minority in so many parts of the world and in so many ways. They were a persecuted minority. Whether it was Christians, Muslims doing the persecuting, they had 2,000 years of experience with that. And so I think they wanted to turn over a new chapter when they assembled here in this land.
Gil, some people are worried that the present White House isn't all that supportive of Israel, and that's emboldening Israel's enemies to strike, maybe even sometime declare all-out war. Can just this threat hanging over it threaten freedom and rights for citizens here in Israel?
Look, it's part of the miracle, because when you're under such pressure, when you're surrounded by such enemies, on the one hand, the tendency to sacrifice rights simply for the sake of security grows and grows. And when you have people like the Iranians constantly calling out for the death of, by the way, big Satan, the United States, as well as little Satan, and we should be very clear who our enemies are, as we being part of the civilized world, it's very easy to kind of button down the hatches and panic. On the other hand, Iran, Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, all give us daily examples of how awful it is to live under totalitarian rule and how wonderful it is to live under democratic rule.
Well, that leads me to a follow-up question, which is that, so here it is, 75 years, Israel's been really the only democracy here, and celebrating these individual rights and liberty and all, and thriving. Fourth happiest nation in the world. Do you think it's making a difference at all in the region? Do you think people who've wanted to destroy Israel are maybe coming around some?
Obviously not enough, and I wish democracy was more contagious, and that's the kind of epidemic we need. But I do actually think you can see changes. First of all, let's look at the excitement of the Abraham Accords and the way in the United Arab Emirates, which still is a dictatorship, there's been a kind of cultural connection and an excitement and an opening of commerce, partially because of the Israeli miracle. And I think I call this peace more. The more peace we have, the more democracy we'll have, the more goodwill we've had. And even if you look at the Palestinian Authority, for all the insanity and all the terrorism and all the delegitimization of Israel and all the anti-Semitism, you also have a situation where Palestinians sometimes go to the Israeli Supreme Court to petition against Israel. And so they're actually learning democratic practices and democratic values even while squelching them. And I like to think that at the end of the day, democracy and goodness and liberty will out.
John, throughout its 75-year history, Israel's swung all the way from far left, far right, and yet has it maintained a sort of a balance when it comes to these things like individual rights, freedom, and liberty?
I think so. I think it's inherent in the people. They want to live differently than the nations that surround them, and I think that they're committed to that. That it's a way of life, like you said, for 75 years. So yes, it will continue despite the threats on both sides of fascism, totalitarianism. You know, you get those charges, but in the end, people get to say their piece, pretty much.
Gil, what do you think? Is it sort of amazing that it's been able to hold that balance despite going way to the left, way to the right?
Not only is it miraculous because it's been going way to the left, way to the right, think about 3 million Jews from all over the world were absorbed in Israel over the last 75 years. Very, very few of them came from democratic countries. They came from the most totalitarian countries in the world, and nevertheless, we created a democracy. And right now, week after week, just a mile away from here, people are yelling and screaming, "There's no democracy!" And I don't yell at them, "That proves there's democracy!" Right? Because when you can get up in the middle of the town square in front of the president's house and yell, "There's no democracy," it's still democratic.
Wow. Well, that's all the time we have. Very interesting discussion. Thank you so much, commentator Gil Troy and analyst John Waggy. And I'm Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.